The morning in Ouagadougou arrived not with fanfare, but with a silence so pure it could only mean danger. The sun was just beginning to stretch its golden fingers across the dense canopy of the presidential compound, casting long shadows that danced on dew-covered grass. Birds chirped with habitual innocence, unaware that death was among the roses. President Ibrahim Traoré knelt quietly beneath the baobab tree he had planted himself 2 years earlier, his hands resting gently on his thighs, lips moving in silent prayer. This was his ritual, dawn solitude, away from the noise of politics and the heaviness of betrayal. But today, the silence felt different. It wasn't peaceful, it was watching him. A man dressed in the olive-green uniform of the garden crew moved toward him, gloved hands gripping a pair of pruning shears. He blended perfectly with the rows of men trimming the hedges, except for one thing: he didn't smell like earth. He reeked of steel, of oil, of cold sweat. His eyes didn't observe plants, they calculated angles, measured steps, and counted seconds. 10 meters.
5, 2.
Then came the flicker. A shadow where there should be none. A tremor in the air like the calm before an ambush. President Traoré's eyes opened, not in fear, but in instinct. The shears transformed, not into a blade, but into a silenced pistol, sleek, black, and aimed squarely at the back of the president's skull. The man stepped forward, confident. He had rehearsed this kill in Geneva, trained for it in Arizona, and was paid in Paris. This was not just a job, it was a geopolitical message. But so was the man he was aiming at. In a single motion, faster than a breath could form, Traoré pivoted and brought his elbow crashing into the man's wrist. The pistol fired, once, missing entirely, silenced not just by its suppressor, but by the leaves above swallowing the sound. A second blow to the solar plexus, then a kick sweeping both legs from beneath. The assassin hit the ground hard, breath knocked out of him, the gun spinning into a rosebush. Soldiers rushed in seconds later, late, but no longer blind. They pinned the attacker down, who still writhed like a man insulted by failure more than pain. Traoré stood over him, breathing evenly, eyes calm but storm-bound.
He didn't speak.
He didn't need to. His presence alone demanded the truth. But the assassin only smiled, a quiet, arrogant smirk that said this was never meant to be clean. A code was found sewn into his glove: Ivory Flame, Phase 1. And in that moment, as the first light of day touched the hem of Traoré's white tunic, the war had already begun, not with bullets or broadcasts, but in silence and with thorns. The room was cold, not from the air conditioning but from something deeper, something older. A chill born of concrete walls that had heard too many confessions and kept them all. It was buried beneath the presidential compound, known only to a handful of men who understood the true weight of silence. The assassin sat restrained, his back straight despite the bruises blooming across his ribs. His lips were split, his left eye swollen, but he smiled, not with defiance, but with calculation. He wasn't afraid. Men like him never were. Not of pain, not of prison, only of failure. And yet, here he was alive, defeated, and forced to look into the eyes of a man he'd been ordered to erase. President Traoré entered without announcement. He didn't need a title in this room. The guards stiffened, but he waved them off. He walked in alone. Not a general, not a head of state. A man seeking the kind of truth that could not be written down, only felt, only hunted. He pulled a chair across from the assassin and sat without speaking. The room hummed with the tension of unanswered questions. Fluorescent light buzzed above like a dying insect. No one moved. Then Traoré broke the silence, not with anger, not with rage, but with something colder. "Who sent you?" The assassin smiled wider. "You already know who." "No," Traoré replied, his voice soft but iron-edged. "I know who they want me to think it was." The man shrugged. "Does it matter? Ivory Flame isn't a who. It's a when. You're already late." Traoré leaned back, eyes never leaving the assassin's. "You don't strike me as a fanatic. Not like those boys who strap themselves to belief. You're too polished." You were trained. You were briefed. You were paid. The assassin's smile twitched. There it was, a crack. Tell me about Geneva, Traore said, not asking.
Stating.
A ghost of memory passed through the assassin's face. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. The president saw it and pressed gently, like a scalpel to scar tissue. You didn't meet a handler there. You met a banker. Your contract was signed in code under a foundation. Civil society. Environmental development. But that's just the new face of private war, isn't it? The assassin finally spoke. You think too small, President. This isn't about Burkina Faso. You just happen to stand on a piece of ground they want quiet. Traore's voice lowered.
They.
Say their name. The man looked away for the first time. Why now? Traore pressed. Why not months ago? Why not after the first purge? Silence. Then the assassin whispered, because you frightened them. Traore blinked. You weren't supposed to last this long, the man continued. You weren't supposed to matter. But when you turned their contractors against each other, when you refused the loans, when you went to Moscow and didn't beg, you became dangerous. Outside the door, the guard shifted. The air was changing. Not with tension, but with understanding. Traore leaned forward. There's more. The man nodded slowly, something almost human in his expression now. This was phase 1. You were the trigger. Now comes the fracture. What fracture? The assassin looked up, bloody calm. Inside your own ranks. There's a name on your staff who's already signed the deal. They needed my bullet to finish the script. But now you've rewritten it. Traore stood, the weight of what he'd heard sinking into the soil of his mind like blood into cloth. He turned to leave. President, the assassin called after him, you'll never find all the pieces. The truth isn't in one room.
It never is.
Traore paused at the door, then said, almost to himself.
No.
But if I listen long enough, the lies start to echo. He stepped out into the corridor, leaving behind a man who thought he had delivered a message. But what he had delivered was a map. And somewhere inside the palace, a fracture had already begun. Night fell on Ouagadougou with a weight that couldn't be explained by darkness alone. The air was too still, the streets too quiet, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Officially, everything was stable. Unofficially, the roots of the regime had begun to whisper. Somewhere, someone inside was leaking. Planning. Waiting. The fracture was real. President Ibrahim Traoré stood before a dusty mirror in a storage room beneath the presidential palace, lit only by a flickering utility bulb. Gone was the white military tunic, the neatly pressed trousers, the emblems of rank. In their place, civilian clothes rough with use, faded jeans, worn boots, and a threadbare shirt with the collar half torn. He pulled a scarf over his head, wrapped tight like the motorcycle couriers who roamed the city without license or fear. Then came the final touch. Dust smeared across his face, hiding the sharpness of his features, the dignity of his title. What remained in the mirror was not a leader, but a man no one would stop to notice. He did not trust his inner circle. Not after the interrogation. Ivory Flame wasn't just a name, it was an infection. It didn't strike from above. It spread sideways, peer-to-peer, handshake to handshake. This wasn't about loyalty anymore. It was about silence and who had learned to weaponize it. He left through the maintenance tunnels, routes built decades ago by foreign engineers during aid missions, meant to serve in emergencies, now repurposed for war without uniforms. 2 guards saw him go. They didn't salute. They didn't speak. They knew. He emerged near the bus depot, amid diesel smoke and shouting vendors. His boots touched dirt the way they had during his earliest years, before coups, before the uniform, before power. He was Ibrahim again.
Just a man.
A shadow among shadows. His mission wasn't to expose the traitor with a speech or a law. That came later. Now he needed to see what power had blinded him from. The streets, the alleys, the whispered networks that knew more than satellites ever could. He needed to listen where no politician ever did. He moved through the outer districts like a ghost. He drank bitter tea with moto-taxi drivers who spoke in parables. He stood in markets where gossip moved faster than money. And he listened to the anger, the fear, the strange hush when certain names were mentioned. Names like Sankone, Cabaret, and one that stopped him cold, Adama Ruamba, his own chief advisor. A man he had once bled beside. A man who now, according to the street, dined too often with Western envoys behind opaque glass. Traore didn't react. Not visibly. But something ancient stirred in his chest. Not rage. Not grief.
Conviction.
He made his way next to a barbershop, dimly lit, with posters of dead revolutionaries peeling from the walls. Inside, an old soldier sat with a straight razor, shaving a man's head with the stillness of someone who had once slit throats for a living. When Traore stepped inside, their eyes met, and a moment passed. No rank, no explanation, just the recognition of two men who'd seen the same fires. The barber nodded to the back room. There, Traore sat in silence with four others. Former comrades. Once officers. Now ghosts in the civilian world. They didn't rise when he entered. That wasn't disrespect, it was equality. "They're moving faster than we thought," Traore said. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with half a hand, replied, "They're not moving fast. We've been standing still." He nodded. They were right. Ivory Flame wasn't just a plot. It was a strategy designed for men like him, men who waited too long to act. And so the decision was made, not in a council hall, not before cameras, but in a room that stank of sweat, soap, and history. Traore stood. "No more speeches," he said. "No more meetings. From now on, we go beneath the noise. I want every compound mapped, every convoy tracked. No more uniforms. No more symbols. If we have to tear the rot from within, it will not be done in gold. It will be done in blood." He walked out the way he came in silence. Back on the street, a child ran past him chasing a punctured football. A dog barked in the distance. Life continued, unaware that the president had walked among them not as a ruler, but as a man reborn into secrecy. The war had begun in silence, but now it moved in shadows. And the man who was once a symbol had become a hunter. The morning sun rose over Ouagadougou, casting long golden fingers through the presidential windows, but the light did not touch Yakuba Dio. He stood in his office, a room of order, of polished boots and neatly framed diplomas, where every file had its place and every gesture was measured. Even his silence had rhythm. He was not a man who shouted, nor one who rushed. He was a man who understood the currency of time, and how slowly, beautifully, treachery could unfold under the guise of loyalty. On his desk lay a sealed report stamped urgent, internal affairs. Inside were names, movements, satellite images, even fabricated whispers about Traore's mental instability following the assassination attempt. It was written in the cool, impersonal language of national concern, but beneath it was the pulse of something darker, the script of a coup dressed in concern, printed on state paper, approved with a general's restraint. General Yakuba Dio was no ordinary traitor. He did not conspire in shadows or meet in basements. He played chess in the open, with a calm so precise it felt holy. And like all elegant betrayals, it began not with a shot, but with a meeting request. He entered the National Security Chamber 2 hours later, uniform immaculate, smile warm, eyes unreadable. Around the table sat ministers, advisors, a few foreign observers carefully labeled as security consultants. Traore's chair was empty, deliberately so. Dio stood. "My brothers and sisters," he began, voice gentle like a prayer, "we are not gathered to seize power. We are gathered to protect it." No one interrupted. His tone was not that of a usurper, it was that of a surgeon explaining a necessary amputation. "Our president is a brave man," he continued. "He has bled for this nation. But bravery and judgment are not always aligned. In recent weeks, he has acted alone. Secret missions, disguises, conversations in slums with unsanctioned operatives. This is not governance. This is delusion." He let the words settle. Not like bombs, but like seeds. "We have evidence," he said, gesturing to the folder. Not just of instability, but of collusion. Russian agents. Questionable funding. A pattern of behavior that raises difficult questions for our allies. He paused, letting the words, our allies, ring long and clear. Then the foreign observers spoke, just enough. One nodded. Another made a note. A third offered the phrase, transitional supervision, like a life raft thrown to a drowning democracy. Yakuba Dio did not gloat. That would be crude. Instead, he nodded solemnly. Let us pray for our president's recovery, he said. And let us prepare, as guardians, to carry the torch until he returns, if he returns. Elsewhere, Ibrahim Traoré, still cloaked in anonymity, watched it unfold. A recording had been leaked to him, perhaps by a sympathizer, perhaps by fate. He stood in a warehouse surrounded by former soldiers and children of the revolution, listening to Dio's calm betrayal with a stillness that frightened even his own men. He said nothing for a long time. Then, he was always good with words. Someone whispered, "We take him out tonight?" Traoré shook his head.
No.
That would make him a martyr. And martyrs don't bleed. The words settled cold. Traoré turned toward the light filtering through the broken warehouse slats. We don't need a bullet, he said. We need a mirror. We'll let the people see who he really is. Strip away the medals. The titles. Make him speak when no one's listening. But how? Traoré smiled, small, grim. Everyone who owes him something will owe us more. And so, the war did not escalate in gunfire. It unfolded in whispers, in cameras hidden in briefcases, in old revolutionaries stepping forward to testify not in court, but in cafes, on live streams, in classrooms. And slowly, methodically, the elegance of Yakuba Dio's betrayal began to unravel, not with explosions, but with truths he could not control. He had bet on silence. But silence, Traoré knew, has a way of turning against its master. The air was heavy with the scent of rust, heat, and old gun oil. Not the kind used in active combat, but the kind that lingered on the fingers of old men who had stopped killing, but never stopped remembering. The rendezvous had no official coordinates. It took place in the belly of an abandoned train yard west of Kubri, where sun-bleached railcars stood like forgotten tombstones. There, beneath the echoes of a dying empire's infrastructure, President Ibrahim Traoré came to meet the one man he could neither confront in public nor ignore in silence. The man they called the handler was already waiting. He stood in the shadow of a gutted cargo container, arms folded, a cigarette trembling between his fingers, not from fear, but from a tremor that never left him after a training accident in Georgia. No one knew his real name. Some said he had once served NATO. Others whispered of black ops gone rogue, of villages erased from maps and replaced with statistics. But what all agreed on was this. He had no country, only contracts. He was a diplomat with a rifle, a soldier with a suit, a ghost who never killed unless it advanced a narrative. Traoré approached, unarmed but not defenseless. He wore the same dust-stained scarf from his nights in the districts, and his boots were scratched from too many alleys. But his eyes burned like iron straight from the forge. There was no fear in them, only clarity, only the weight of choices made. The handler didn't speak first. He simply offered the cigarette, a gesture as old as peace talks and betrayals. Traoré declined. You've changed, the man said, his voice dry as desert wind. No, Traoré replied. I just stopped pretending I hadn't seen the blood. The handler nodded slowly. So, why meet? You know what I am. Yes, Traoré said. You are the enemy. Not because of what you've done, but because you've convinced my own people that silence is strategy. That dignity can be traded for loans. That fear wears a necktie and calls it self-order. The man smiled. And what do you call it? This thing you're doing? Walking around in rags, giving speeches to ghosts. That's not leadership. That's theater. No, Traoré said softly. It's resistance. And resistance begins where theater ends, when the curtain doesn't fall, when the actor keeps standing even after the audience leaves. The handler's eyes narrowed. You want to die for this? I want to live in a country that doesn't need men like you to survive. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was violent. A kind of stillness that made both men reach, not for guns, but for truth sharper than steel. The handler took a slow drag from his cigarette and blew smoke between his teeth. I could end this tonight. I have 10 men within a mile. One phone call and you vanish. And yet, Traore said, stepping closer, you're still talking. That's the difference between power and fear. You have the former. I carry the latter. The handler's face changed, not in fear, but in recognition. This was no longer a young officer caught in history's current. This was a man who had stepped outside of the script, who had nothing to lose, who had seen war and chosen silence, not as surrender, but as strategy. Traore leaned in, voice low and razor-edged. You know the war is no longer in the jungle or in the streets. It's in the souls of the people. And there, you have no operatives, no satellite, no leverage. The handler smiled again, but this time it was sad. I don't need to win, he said. I just need to make sure you don't. And that, Traore replied, is why you've already lost. He turned and walked away, boots crunching gravel, each step defying the narrative written for him. Behind him, the handler did not call for his men. He did not draw a weapon. He only stood still, watching a leader walk away from the edge and take the war with him. That night, no bullets were fired. No headlines broke. But in the silence between two men, a different war was declared, the kind that cannot be heard, only felt. And for the first time in years, the handler looked at the darkness and wondered if he had just met its heir. It wasn't just a jailbreak. It was a message, a scar carved into the very walls of the regime's illusion of control. When Daniel Kane disappeared from the subterranean cell beneath Ouagadougou's central detention compound, it wasn't through a tunnel or a breach in the wall. It was through the cracks in loyalty, through silence bought with fear, through a smile from a guard who had watched one too many sons die in useless wars. The escape wasn't loud, but it echoed. Traore stood over the empty cell at dawn, staring not at the broken lock or the smeared boot prints, but at the absence, the deliberate, surgical emptiness where his most dangerous prisoner used to be. Kane, the fallen contractor, the voice of 1,000 deniable operations, had vanished into the streets of a city still dreaming of peace. But it wasn't the escape that haunted Traore, it was the timing. 2 days earlier, he had met the handler. And now the second strike had landed. Kane wasn't like other fugitives. He didn't run. He moved, like a virus waking from latency. No burnt cars, no shootouts, no trail of blood, just a shift in atmosphere. People looked over their shoulders more. Phones rang once and went silent. Entire neighborhoods grew quieter, like they sensed something unnatural in their alleys.
He was in the city.
And he wasn't alone. Daniel Kane had once been a legend among private military networks. Not for his strength, but for his precision. His violence was never passionate. He didn't hate. He didn't rage. He executed. Cold, clinical, clean. And now, he had a new mission. Not to kill Traore, but to collapse him from within. One trust at a time. One institution. One whisper. One planted doubt. Reports started arriving at the presidential bunker. A missing intelligence officer. A clerk who resigned after his child was pulled from school. A city councilwoman found weeping in her car with a manila envelope of surveillance photos she couldn't explain. No gunshots. No claims. Just decay. Just Kane. Traore gathered his inner circle. They were loyal, most of them. But in that moment, even their silence sounded like betrayal. He's not fighting us, the Minister of Interior whispered. He's infecting us. Traore nodded, fingers steepled, eyes hollow but steady.
No.
He's mirroring us. Showing us what we ignored. What we built our new republic upon. Old bones and fragile masks. The truth was bitter. Kane had never been fully imprisoned. Not mentally. Not spiritually. He was always playing the long game. And now that he was free, he wasn't running away. He was walking straight into the country's moral center, pulling wires from beneath the floors of the revolution itself. But Traore didn't panic. He knew Cain wasn't the disease. He was the symptom, the echo of old wars that had never ended, only rebranded. He was the consequence of decades of silence, of dignity sold in bulk, of men in suits who called blood leverage. Still, Cain had to be stopped. But how do you fight a ghost made from your own shadow? Traore didn't order raids. He didn't unleash fear. Instead, he went where Cain couldn't follow, into the streets, among the people. Not to hide, but to show. He walked unguarded through marketplaces, sat in mosques where the air smelled of dust and old prayers. He whispered truths into the ears of those who had once been courted by fear. He showed them Cain without ever saying his name. And slowly, Cain began to lose oxygen. This wasn't a manhunt. This was containment by conscience. A strategy no war school had ever taught. But it came at a cost. One night, as the rain poured like ash across the capital, a bomb detonated beneath the vehicle of Major Diallo, Traore's oldest ally, his wartime friend, the man who had once pulled him bleeding from a coup's failed ashes. His body was recovered in pieces. The message was clear. You may heal the people, but I will break the heart. Traore didn't cry. He didn't rage. He stood under the rain, staring at the wreckage, eyes unblinking, lips barely moving as he whispered, "Then come closer, Cain. Because only one of us can still bleed." And from somewhere in the city, behind glass, behind a phone, Daniel Cain smiled, for the second blow had landed, and the real war had just begun. It began just after midnight, under a moon that hid behind a veil of slow-moving smoke. The capital city slept with one eye open, its streets blanketed in curfews that no one truly believed in anymore. Somewhere in Sector 4, in a warehouse registered to a dissolved mining cooperative, Traore's intelligence team struck. But this wasn't a police raid. It was a reckoning. They didn't come with sirens or megaphones. They came in silence, like Cain once did. Faces painted, rifles wrapped in rags to muffle metal, eyes full of something colder than revenge. These weren't men sent to arrest. They were there to unveil. Inside that rusted shell of a building, hidden beneath piles of paperless cargo, was what Cain had left behind, deliberately, precisely, like a signature written in shadow. It wasn't a weapons cache. It wasn't a hostage nest. It was a map, not one drawn in ink, but in threads. Strings of information pulled from surveillance logs, leaked emails, and personal diaries stolen from the very desks of cabinet ministers. A web of relationships, betrayals, debts, and favors, names without titles, faces without captions, patterns of movement charted with military precision. Cain had been watching for years. Not just Traore, not just his enemies. Everyone. A wall stood at the center of the warehouse. On it were hundreds of photographs, time-stamped, annotated, connected by black yarn like a patient psychopath or a tired historian. Some faces were circled in red, others slashed. A few, very few, were burned, the ashes left scattered like quiet funerals. And in the middle, framed under a cracked piece of plastic, was Traore's own face. Not defaced, not marked, just there, neutral.
Come.
Understood. He wasn't the target. Not yet. He was the constant. The soldiers took photos, cataloged everything, but none dared touch the map itself. They stood there, shifting their boots against concrete that smelled of ink and humidity, feeling something larger than a manhunt. This was a doctrine, a blueprint of destabilization written by someone who didn't need missiles, just time, pressure, and the willingness to listen longer than anyone else. And behind that wall, behind a steel door sealed by biometric lock, they found the archive. Drives upon drives. Labeled by codenames and operatives, years and ciphers. One folder titled Ashfall Protocol. Another, simply the garden. What garden? Whose? None of it made sense in isolation, but it wasn't meant to. Cain's brilliance was that he never played for the moment. He wrote scripts for years ahead, left tools not for himself, but for those who would come after. He wasn't a man escaping. He was a man preparing succession. When Traore arrived, the rain had already begun again, light, like breathing. He walked alone into the building, shoulders drawn back, but hands loose, like a soldier remembering his original war. No one saluted him.
No one needed to.
The weight in the room demanded silence. He stood in front of his own face on the wall. He studied it, not with fear but with recognition. The way a veteran looks at an old uniform, full of things only he could understand. "He doesn't want to kill me," Traore finally said. "He wants me to see." A young officer stepped forward, voice tight. "Sir, with this data, we could neutralize half the political machine. Clean sweep." But Traore shook his head.
No.
That's what he wants. Kane doesn't give us weapons. He gives us mirrors. This isn't leverage. It's temptation. And the young officer fell silent because deep down they all felt it. The power in that room. The seductive clarity of seeing everyone's secrets in one place. It was biblical. And it was poison. That night, Traore didn't sleep. He sat in the war room, watching the map spread across digital screens, every line a reminder of how close Kane had always been. How deeply he had embedded himself. Not as an enemy, as a historian, a cartographer of corruption. Morning came like a blade, and across the city, anonymous envelopes began arriving at the homes of judges, journalists, school teachers. Not threats, not demands, just fragments of truth, photos, documents, confessions buried long ago. Kane's hand was no longer acting through violence. He was releasing memory. The second blow had shaken the regime. The third, this raid, had revealed the scale of the war. But what came next was something worse than an explosion. It was awakening. Kane was no longer hiding.
He was teaching.
And the city, whether it knew it or not, was listening.